Welcome to this lecture on James chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. So, this is the second half of this double epitome. So, chapter 1, verses 2 through 12 really do kind of create a table of contents for everything that follows. But verses 13 through 25 actually do kind of like a second take of that. And so they revisit some of the themes that were already done, but also prefigure a lot of these chapters that are coming. So it's like the second table of contents, if you will. So just like 2 through 12, James here again gives in 2 or 3 sentences what entire sections will be later on. So that's how this works. And this was interesting because 13 through 21 does deal with this kind of the progressiveness, or like progressing towards progression to perfection, and you'll see this, or this digression, a progressive digression. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's kind of how I think about it. This digression towards evil, or a progression to perfection. So James absolutely understands the world in binary terms. It's the Roman evil world against, that's over against God and God's people, or the world that God would have for God's people. So you'll see how this plays out, but already these kind of distinctions have already been set up in what's preceded. So let's look at this section of James. The first several verses here, I'll talk about this painting here. This is a painting from the city of Pompeii. It's probably the least erotic of all the paintings. I mean, just Google paintings from Pompeii. This is the Roman city that was destroyed during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in like the first century before the Common Era, or the first century of the Common Era. I can't remember what century it was, but there's all these erotic paintings all over these walls, and they've been perfectly preserved because of that ash that came from the eruption. So this was the least erotic that I could find, just because I didn't want to totally offend everybody. But we'll talk about this a little bit. This is Ares and Aphrodite, two gods here. So let's just kind of jump into this section. Verse 13, James uses it's the first time James uses direct speech in the letter. And so he basically says, I am being tried by God. This is something that he puts on the lips of his interlocutor. This is part of diatribe, which is a rhetorical style of argumentation. I think Luke Timothy Johnson does a good job of describing this, so I won't go into detail. But the whole point is, James is basically saying, don't say I'm being tried by God. So the question arises, does God try people? So this is not the question that comes from putting this on his opponent's lips. I mean, the obvious question to me is, like, who said this? What's James trying to do by with this kind of argumentation? Is he arguing against teachings that the people have been told? But another question, and Johnson does a good job with this as well, is like, does God try people? Does God test people? And James says no. Desire, in verse 14, epitome, drags and entices. This language, drag away and entice, is language of sexual violence. So it's hypersexual. It doesn't come through in English translations, but the vocabulary that James is employing here is incredibly sexual. So this dragging away and enticing, this is kind of rape language here. And I don't mean to say that. I don't say that lightly. And I don't mean to say that to kind of offend anybody. I want to be real sensitive around that kind of stuff, especially um, rape and sexual violence. But that is the language that's being used here, to drag away and entice. And this is why I showed this painting of Ares and Aphrodite from Pompeii. Um, there's a lot of stories in Roman mythology about how gods do this stuff. They rape women, humans. They rape other goddesses. And so James, I think, is doing something, not just to critique the Roman pantheon, or because they were polytheists. Um, he's basically saying God doesn't do that. God doesn't tempt people. It's desire, epithemia, that does this. So he's creating this dichotomy between God and desire. Um, and the Greco-Roman world, certainly the Greeks and the Romans, had a lot. I mean, they had a different kind of sexual mores than we do today, and there were nude statues and paintings all over the public. So they just didn't have kind of the sexual ethic that happens today in the West. So I think that it's James is really playing on that kind of culture to critique it. Again, in verse 15, it talks about these desires who drag away and entices, and they conceive and give birth. Again, this is more sexually charged language about conception and birth. Um, in verse 16, James comes back around and says, "Do not be led astray or led away." And this, basically, don't blame God for tempting you. Don't blame God for testing you, because it's not God doing it. It's your own desires, your own epithemia, and to believe that God is doing this is a total misconception. And what's interesting here, he uses beloved brothers. Now, this is the first time he says brothers before adelphoi, but agapetoi, beloved. The word agape is in there, it means love. So, beloved brothers, this is certainly internal language. So he's really warning the community, those who are on the inside, and saying, "Hey, listen, don't buy into this." So it begs the question: is another teacher in the Jesus community teaching that God tests people? I mean, that's a logical question to ask based on this kind of argumentation. He's talking to people inside the Jesus community, and he's saying, "Don't believe this." And it seems like maybe somebody is telling them that that's what's going on. So it's kind of begging the question. So, do trials come from God, or do trials come from desire? It's certainly directed towards those within the community. Did this direct discourse, God has tempted me, come from the community or from other teachers and leaders? In other words, is this a question that the community is just kind of dealing with, and they've organically kind of came up and said, "We don't know how to handle this," and James is writing this to address it? Or is this something that another leader or another teacher has been teaching these Jesus following communities throughout the Greco-Roman world, in the diaspora, right? I mean, that's the question. But this is where James makes this big distinction between God and desire, and this is part and parcel of James' whole worldview. James understands the entire world as a world that is divided between good and evil, between God and the world. He'll use the world often. You'll see it as we go through the semester. World is a word that James uses often. It's cosmos. It's always depicted as evil. Very seldom does he talk about the world as something good. So it's a dualistic understanding of the world. Um, and he does not believe that people should transgress that boundary. But this progression or digression, especially a digression from epitome of this desire that gives birth to sin, and then sin gives birth to death. That digression is kind of the reverse negative of the kind of language used in verses 2 through 4. There you get the word trials is used, the same Greek word in verse 2 as in verse 13. The theme of, in verses 3 through 4, it's this progression where one virtue gives birth to the next and to the next. Endurance leads to, faith leads to endurance, and endurance leads to XYZ. Well, here it's the reverse negative. It's, desire leads to sin, and sin leads to death. So this is how this is the beginning of that double epitome. This is the second iteration of the table of contents. But let's go back to, does God test? We didn't really deal with that yet. In Genesis chapter 22, this is called the Akedah. This is where Abraham offers Isaac to God, because God tells Abraham, you need to sacrifice Isaac. And it says he tests Abraham. And we know that James knows the Akedah from Genesis 22, because it's Genesis 22 that he references in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. He talks about Abraham's faith is proven because he's willing to sacrifice his son. So we know that James knows Genesis 22. And it's Genesis 22 that says that God tested Abraham. And here, James says that God does not test people. I mean, it's a clear contradiction, but it makes you think that there's another teacher out there talking about God tempting and God testing, and James is confronting that kind of teaching. So it would be really good to look at the word epithemia, desire, and see how often Paul uses it, because I'm gonna keep going back to this James Paul dichotomy and discourse and disagreement. So how does Paul use epithemia? How does Paul look at desire? What does that happen there? Well, this all sets up a strong dualism between God and desire / Rome. I mean, this is part and parcel what the whole letter of James is about. But you can see here 13 through 16, you see how it lays out and kind of echoes what's gone before and prefigures what's coming next. So let's move to this progressive perfection in verses 17 through 19. Perfect is the word teleos, complete, perfect, and that's a major theme throughout the letter of James. It sets up the whole letter. It is the goal of faith, I think, in the letter of James. But in verse 17, it talks about gift, dosis and dorema. Dosis is literally gift, and it means, in a verbal form, it's to give. So here you get the word gift in verse 17, and it goes all the way back to verse 5, where God, if you remember, God gives generously. Gerontes is the Greek word, and here you get that double epitome right real quick. Verse 17 is really parallel to verse 5, where the gift in God's generosity are parallel. So it also shows you how connected this first chapter is. Then you get perfect, right? Teleion in verse 17, and it goes back to verse 4, teleoi, and become this perfection and purity is exactly what the entire letter of James is about. And I do think it's ritual purity. I mean, James understands purity in a ritual sense. Now, this is where Luke Timothy Johnson and I disagree. Johnson does not think that James has anything ritual in mind. He only reads James as being someone who talks about morality, and so pure morality that is pure and undefiled. The way you behave, and that is certainly the case. I mean, that's absolutely the case in the letter of James. James is absolutely arguing for certain kind of behavior. Faith without action is dead. So you know that James requires action, and that action is morality. But it has absolutely the idea of purity and the idea of teleion, perfection. This is ritual language. So he's not just ritualizing morality. I think the language he uses is evidence of of ritual. So I don't think James would say, "Hey, listen, you have to love your neighbor as yourself, but you don't have to be circumcised." I think that's the whole law for James is important, and so this word "perfect" uh, is part of the way he feels like you have to follow the law. It's not just one part of the law. It's just not one Ten Commandment. It's the whole thing. And he'll argue that later on. But the way he uses ritual language with purity and perfection, I think I think it's just incorrect to think that James doesn't have ritual in mind here. The other one here in verse 17. Verse 17 is full of language that looks back and looks forward. This descent from above, anathen, it means from above or again. It corresponds to wisdom in chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. The wisdom that is from above, the word there is anathen, is the same word. Now, I've argued that James is written very early. The Gospel of John is written very late. But this is the same word that causes Nicodemus confusion in chapter 3. Yeah, chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, where Jesus says a person has to be born from above. He uses this word anathen. And anathen can also mean again. And so that's why Nicodemus asked Jesus, like, how can a man be born again does he have to enter the womb again? Well, that is a play on the term anathen. Here, it's got the more common usage of the term from above. So this descent from above, prefigures the wisdom that comes from above in chapter 3 through 18, this anathen. And here is return to this sexual language, giving birth, conception. And here in verse 18, it says that God gives birth. God gave birth to us. So this is, again, using sexual language just like desire gave birth to sin and sin gave birth to death. Here you got God giving birth to us. So this is positive connotations. So don't think that the sexual language that's being used is evil just because it's sexual. Earlier it was sexual, and there was sexual violence, being drug away, stuff. But sexual language, again, giving birth to, is not always bad, right? This is a positive way to think about it. And it's the exact opposite of verse 15, but it uses the same Greek word, apakuo, to give birth. And giving birth is, there's nothing sexual about giving birth, but the way apakuo in Greek functions, it is certainly part of sexual discourse. So that's exactly what's being used here. So this word of truth, logoaletheos, we don't know what this is. I mean, it begs the question. It's certainly a generative entity. So it's, you were given birth, God gave birth by the word of truth. This word logos, certainly, I mean, it makes you want to jump straight to Jesus because of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. But again, the Gospel of John is so much later. There's no way that James is using John. John comes decades later. And there's no evidence that John actually uses James. There is a lot of tradition of the Logos tradition in Judaism. The Philo of Alexandria writes, he has Logos theology, and this idea that the word, the spoken word of God is its own thing, almost becomes personified. And so it begs the question: so is this Genesis? Is this like is James thinking of Jesus? Or is he thinking of Genesis, which is exactly where Logos theology comes from, where God speaks and there's creation that's happened? It's certainly clear that James is thinking of Genesis here and not Jesus. And there you got this no, beloved brothers. And no, again, there's this parallel between verse 19 and verse 13. I think I already told you guys to look every time there's these cognitive words, knowledge, consider, pay real close attention to that, because for James, action and thought are really tied close together. And again, beloved brothers is used again here, but whereas before it was like, beloved brothers, don't do this. Here it's the exact opposite usage, but the same terms. Again, it's like, beloved brothers, do this. So it's turned on its head again. So you see over and over again how James is like making a tight-knit argument in chapter 1, and really kind of creating all these word chains that connect the verses really tight. They go back and forth as far as what they referred to previously and what they're looking forward to and are anticipating later on. It's really artfully done, but this whole section can be kind of his section on perfection, right? This progression towards perfection. But then, again, you get this two worlds thing. In this picture here, I just couldn't find a good one. This is an old drawing of the persecution of Christians later on in the Roman Empire. What I was trying to do is find something to illustrate two worlds, right? Here, this is the saints versus the lions in real life, right? The Christian saints versus the Roman lions. But James absolutely understands the world this way. There's no getting around it. And so in this section, he talks about anger, which the word itself is a word chain in verses 20 and 19. And listen, if you can remember anything about this chapter 1, think about word chain. It's just a chain of words that really connect one section to the next. And here the word is anger. The other word that James always goes back to is erga, or ergon. It's work. So anger does not work. It doesn't produce. So how do you translate this? Anger doesn't work, or anger produces, doesn't produce. This idea of erga, work, is so central to James. It goes all the way back to verse 3. So here you get ergazesthai. Ergazesthai, I think in verse 3 it's katergazamai or katergazma. It's the same. I mean, verse 3 has a prefix on it, but there's even textual variance in verse 3 where they actually put a prefix on this ergazisthai word so that it would comply with verse 3. But it doesn't matter. The word that's the root word here is erga, and that's why I have it underlined for you. And erga means work. So this is just a major theme throughout the letter of James. It is James is interested in action. How does action show or prove your identity? Action and being are intimately linked to James, and that is the reason there are two worlds, right? Your actions determine who you are, and that determines whether you are in God's realm or in the world's realm, and that's it's just straight up dualism. But what's really cool in verse 20 and 21 is this is the first time James uses a major word in New Testament, in New Testament theology, really, dikaiosune. And you can translate it justice or righteousness. I tend to translate dikaiosune as justice rather than righteousness. Righteousness tends to be a much more religiously heavy term, and I think we miss what righteousness actually means because we can dismiss it almost too much as a church term, where dikaiosune literally means righteousness, to be right, or justice, to be just. And I prefer to translate it as justice. I mean, it's absolutely up to us to make that decision as translators. So I translate it as justice because it gives a much more real, kind of fleshy, human, action oriented response. I mean, when people hear righteousness, I think they think church. When people hear justice, they think of action in the public sphere. And that's exactly what James has in mind here. So I don't think James is using kind of laden religious terminology. He's using justice from a public sphere point of view because that's where it is. It demands action. So justice in verse 20 is the first occurrence in the letter, and it's worth noting that Paul uses this term often, dikaiosune, and he uses it with an incredible importance. So Romans 1:17, 3:5, and 3:22, 10:3. Look at that and see how Paul uses this term justice. And look at 1 Corinthians 1:30 and 2 Corinthians 5:21. I mean, that's just look at how Paul uses it. And for James here, he's basically saying that anger is incongruent with justice. Anger does not produce justice. It's interesting to couch it like this because he's creating these two polar opposites, anger and justice. And this, again, kind of separates the world in two for James. It goes into that God and desire and that kind of stuff. So let's keep looking in verse 21, this idea of filth and evil. Again, this idea of filth, dirtiness, and it literally means like dirty laundry or something. That's very different than purity, ritual purity. Evil, obviously, is kakan. It's the opposite of good. And verse 21 actually acts as kind of almost like an antithesis to purity in verse 27. And 27 is like the theme of the whole letter, right? Pure and undefiled religion before God is this. Well, here in verse 21, it talks about filth and evil as something you have to take off like dirty clothes. And again, you get these incredible rhetorical tropes, this alliteration with P. We've already seen how he does this before. Apathemenoi, the P up, pasan, paresia, prauteti. So in English, as we put away, pasan is all. Periseia is excessive, and prauteti is a derivation of humility. And you see, I mean, you just lose all of that in English. I don't know how to put away all excessive and humility rhyme in any kind of way whatsoever. I mean, in Greek, you got this alliteration happening on the P sound, op, pas, per, prau. James does this all the time, and it's Greco. It's really good Greek rhetoric, and so it's obvious that he knows what he's doing here, and he's driving home a point, right? And the point is, the first half of verse 21 acts as the evil opposite of the second half of verse 21. So it's almost like a good preacher. When a good preacher is going on, she can really kind of create some rhythm that drives home a point. So it's not just rhythm for rhythm's sake. It is rhythm to really hammer the point in. And the point is there's evil and there is good, and they are not the same. So humility here then contrasts with anger in verse 20 and reiterates the theme of humility, lowliness from verses 9 through 12, which we talked about earlier. So again, you get this kind of revisiting the same themes, the second half of the table of contents. And this word receive here, receive, what you will know as the implanted word, it contrasts with put away filth and evil, or take off filth and evil. So in verse 20, so receive, contrast, and put away. And you get this really nice kind of this or that, this or that, this or that James is doing. He's really he's preaching here, and he's hammering a point. Implanted word here, this contrast with filth and evil, and it may correspond to the word of truth. In verse 18, the word here is it's the same, literally the same word, logos, but instead of aletheia, you get, which is truth, you get implanted word. This is what's able to save your souls, and able to save yourself. Able to is one word. It can also mean power to, able to, can. It just depends on how you translate it. Save your soul. So this is full of meaning. So let's kind of parse that out a little bit. Able to, power. This is dynamenon, which you get our word dynamite. Dunamos is Greek word, so you get dynamite from this word. This is power, able to, you can. So it's contrasted with human ability. I mean, James uses this word dunamos quite a bit. Dunamao. In chapter 4, verse 2, it's basically he's talking about human inability. Humans are not able to achieve, there's your word again, epitome, the desires. So you get dunamos used quite often in places where God is able and humans are not able, right? God can, humans can't. God is powerful too, humans are not powerful too. To what? To save, sozai. This means save or heal. Here it means probably save. And this is contrasted to 2:14, the faith works binary. He basically says faith alone is not able, same as dunamos, to save, sozai. So where God is able to save, faith without works is not able to save. So it creates an incredible contrast, but it's congruent in chapter 4:12 where it says that God has the power to save and destroy. God is able to save and destroy. God is dunamos to sozai. So, this is more contrast from James, and he uses these words quite a bit in his letter. Your souls, this is Sukos. This is important because Sukos is soul, life, spirit. Uh, it can be any of those things. It depends on how you translate it. We typically translate it as soul. But here you have God is able to, or the implanted word is able to save your souls. And this word sukos, it contrasts with the two souls, or the two-faced, or the double-minded, the dipsukos. So the dipsukos, the dy is di, it means two. Sukos means soul. I do think this is intentional use. I mean, he could have used Zoe. Is the implanted word is able to save your life. That would make more sense. Able to save your um, pneuma, spirit. Sukos is just a real interesting word to use at this juncture. And I think he's using it rhetorically to create a contrast to a word that he's already working with, this dipsukos. So I think it's intentional here. I don't think we have to worry about, oh, is this soul, or is this spirit, or is this life? It's actually just a play on words, reminding the reader to think about that two-faced person. Well, you know what? Don't be that two-faced person. God is able to save the single face, the single soul. And throughout this section, I just want you to kind of get this in your mind. Throughout this section, James is establishing his conviction that the world is evil, and that evilness stands in contrast to God. Um, this is a major thing in James, and you can see it already working out in this second half of this double epitome. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. If you have anything, just let me know. Hope you enjoyed this interesting section of James. We got two more lectures in chapter 1, and we'll be out of chapter 1 and really start getting into the body of the letter. Take care.